Good morning, everyone. My name is Davin Dumas. As Simon has said, I'm from San Diego Ojibwe First Nation. We are Treaty 1 First Nation, and I'm actually in Winnipeg, right in the middle of Treaty 1 territory. So I'm glad that you are all able to be here this morning. Today I'm going to be talking about leading cultural language development in First Nation schools. There's a few things that I'm going to cover today, but for the most part, today we're going to look at change. One of the things that um, I have been really stressing lots in my recent presentations and the work that we do with our member First Nations here in Manitoba is change. And one of the first things we talk about is why we must change. You know, more than ever, we're finding that our students are in crisis. And you hear people talk about how youth look lost walking around. And unfortunately, that being lost is leading them to things that are not healthy for them. We also hear of how our youth are unsure of their identity. And this includes how they fit in the world, which is an important part of First Nations uh, knowledge and beliefs, is understanding your identity and where you fit into the world. And it would be hard for anybody if they don't know and understand where they fit. It would be confusing. So it's it's a difficult time, especially with the drugs that are taking over in a lot of our First Nations communities. Why we must change, when we talk about education, because we are educators for the most part, and we're talking about education leadership series, school attendance. We are finding that students are not coming to school. They're feeling scared, and they're not seeing the importance anymore of what's being done in school. So we have to change that. We have to change that view for our students. We have to change that view for our parents and our community members as well. And ultimately, why we must change, it's our responsibility. If we don't take the responsibility to change, nobody is going to do it for us. So it's our responsibility to do what we can to make our schools inviting, safe, for both students, parents, communities, community members, elders, but also to make education meaningful again. When we talk about the status of First Nations education or schooling as we call it is not working. The way we have it set up, the way the curriculum has it set up, the way provincial authorities, our ministries of education have us implementing education is not working. Our systems are mostly academic focused on students gearing towards post-secondary education. And we're not seeing a lot of success in students moving in that direction. So again, we need to change that. When we think about education, I think as educators, our goal should be 100% success. And if our system is only designed for academics and not for other areas, then we're not going to achieve that 100% success. We're going to continue at the current success rates, which are very low, which are below, in a lot of cases, 50% success rate in high school, which is even lower when we get to post-secondary. And again, what we determine as success is what needs to guide us, not what a provincial system determines as success. In Manitoba, they gauge high school success on students finishing high school in 4 years. And if they don't finish in that 4 years, then they're considered something wrong with them, that they're not successful. To me, if we can get students to graduate and graduate from a system that we've designed and that we endorse, that's success, not based on what somebody else is telling us. And again, that education comes from a very westernized perspective, westernized in terms of how they feel students succeed. And for the most part, they don't look at First Nations in that context, and they don't follow or believe in the same things that we do. For a long time, we had a lot of funding restrictions. Those have eased a bit in recent years with the new funding that has come in regards to education, but there still are funding restrictions with that. And a big area that is capital. If we don't have the space to run the programs, then money doesn't solve it all. Especially when we start talking about some of the programs that our communities are running, like land-based education, which is really expensive. But also if we get into the technical vocational side as well. A lot of our schools, I only know of one school, First Nation school in Canada, that has a technical vocational program. So we're a long ways behind in providing vocational programming. And again, I mentioned this already, drugs. Drugs are running rampant in our communities. They're being a point where our youth are turning to for many different reasons. Alcohol. Alcohol is still a factor in many communities for students and parents. And again, we're seeing those effects still coming into the schools, affecting not only students, but some staff even. And then overall, when we talk about all this colonization is still very strong. It's still there, and it's still having an impact on the way we run schools, on education, and even within governmental systems, even with our registration status for First Nations. It's still very much there, colonization aspect. So, you know, we have to really think about these things and keep them in the back of our mind when we're talking about change in education. One of the slides I like to share when I'm doing presentation is this one, where it says, if you no longer speak your language and no longer practice your culture, then you have no right to demand Aboriginal rights from us because you're assimilated with the ruling power. Part of the reason I share this is our elders, when we meet with our elders, we'll bring a copy of this as a reminder of what the government has tried to do and is still trying to do. And of course, this was said by Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the current Prime Minister's father. And I know I've heard elders talk about we have to be careful because sometimes the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So if he heard this growing up, what's imprinted in him may still be there. So we need to encourage each other so that this type of thing doesn't happen. We don't want this to happen. We don't want to be assimilated by the ruling power. And by their design, if we lose our languages and no longer practice our culture, then they've accomplished what they've been trying to do for a long time. So again, we'll keep this in the back of our mind as we go through today's presentation. So again, when we talk about why people don't change or why we don't change, the first factor is change is not easy. It's difficult. It takes time, it takes resources, and people sometimes are just reluctant for it, to do it. They would rather stay on the path that they're on, even though they know that it's not the right path, possibly for our students, for First Nation students, but they'll continue on that path. And part of it is the training that they received drilled into them. Curriculum is the only way, it's the right way, and that's the way you have to go. And I too, when I first started my career in education, I believe that as well. The curriculum was to solve all the problems of the world and it will make us all successful and is what we need to cram down children's throats because of the training that we received in teacher education. We found out that it's not the best thing in a lot of cases. Don't get me wrong, there are uh, many people that are successful in that system, but there's probably more that were not successful than those that are successful. So if it works for some, it doesn't work for all. So what can we do? When we talk about change, we have to talk about reversing colonization and start decolonizing. And again, those are in the last few years have been really catchy phrases and terms, but we have to really dive into what those mean and start actually implementing decolonization in the way we think, in the way we operate, in the way we do education. And again, uh, as education leaders, that's where we need to embed ourselves is in that mindset of how do we change? We have to recognize the historical trauma that's still very much alive in a lot of us. The residual effects of residential schools are still very strong. My mother was a residential school survivor, and we didn't know any different when we were younger. But as an adult and as we learn, we start to see the actual damage that was done. And one of the strongest things was my mother didn't teach us the language because she didn't want us to be punished for speaking our language as she was. But there are some of us that were able to reclaim our languages and speak fluently after finding out why, right? It's no, it's not to say bad about anybody, for not passing on language, but we're at a time now where we need to start thinking about that differently and changing that and bringing back languages and bringing back culture. I know one of the factors why people don't change is that the resources are minimal. We don't have a lot of resources, or we didn't have a lot of resources to support the teaching of language and culture. We didn't have the books, we didn't have the posters and so forth. So that's changing. Our organization, as example, is creating a ton of resources to support the teaching of language and culture. In the last 6 to 8 months, we've actually hired 4 cultural facilitators now that can go out and support cultural learning in the schools and provide guidance with ceremonies, teachings, and so forth, which was unheard of even for our organization up until this year. But the demand is there. They're some of our busiest facilitators. So there is change happening. We do see it. We do see communities that have been dominated by other religions, if you want to think of it that way, who are coming back and wanting to um, revitalize or regain those practices of our First Nations people. So it's coming. It's slow, but it's coming. And a lot of times why people don't change is because they're unsure of the process. How do we go about doing that? Change takes time, it takes planning, development, and implementation. You want to think about it in that context. But again, it's people feeling safe to make those changes as well. And probably one of the main reasons that we see is there's a lack of mandate to change. So when I talk about a lack of mandate, meaning that perhaps um, chief and council or education authorities have not or are reluctant to mandate change, where they step in and say, from now on, we're going to do things our way. We're going to do things the First Nations way. We're going to mandate that change, and everybody's going to have to do that. So until a lot of communities, a lot of education leaders get that directive from the higher ups, it's a factor in why we don't change. So with that, how do we change? And what I've been telling people is that we really need to look at the key, and the key is language and culture. Like I said earlier, I didn't always think like this in my education career. It's only been over the last, you know, in the last 8 or so years where I've really started to shift my thinking in education that we must start looking at language and culture as the key to change. And when you think about it, our current education system is based on a foreign language and a foreign culture. Essentially, and one of one of the terms that I heard that best describe it is we're teaching English immersion, is what we're teaching in our schools on our First Nations. If you're not running a full First Nation language immersion program, then you're teaching English immersion. And when you think about it, embedded in that English language is cultures, a mix of cultures that are not ours. And we've been forced and continue to be forced into this foreign education system. You know, uh, one of the elders talked to me one time and said, if you think about it, if China were colonizers, we would all be speaking one of the Chinese dialects, implementing education based on their culture. So it could have been any of the other nations. If they were the colonizers, primary colonizers of our territory, we would be speaking their language and practicing their culture. So by changing, we can implement education to be in First Nation language instruction, implementing First Nation education and culture. And again, with doing that, it would really change the view of education for a lot of people, including our youth. And I know a lot of the younger ones are asking questions now. They're asking questions. You hear them talking about, well, I know, and this is an example, I know we follow the church, but we've learned that the church wasn't always here. So what did our people do before that? How did we believe? How did our great grandfathers and grandmothers, how did they believe? And when I was asked that question by staff when I was a principal, they said, well, how do we answer that? And I said, tell them the truth. As educators, we're not in the business of lying. We're in the business of providing facts and truth. So we started to do that. And it really started to ease the transition into the focus of language and culture. And it's the youth that in a lot of communities now that are coming up and saying, well, we want to do it our way. We wanted to do it the way of our grandfathers and grandmothers, not of a foreign way, not of a way that was imposed. So it's interesting when we look at that and we start to see that change. And I worked in a community during that time of change. And, it happened a lot quicker than I thought it would. And making a long story short, it was actually the church elders who spoke up and said, if that's the way our youth want to learn and pray, then let them, because they need to believe in something. And I thought that was a very pivotal point in the reacceptance, if you want to think of that, of our cultural ways and practices of coming back into community. It's the elders acknowledging that, the youth need to believe in something. And if that's the way they want to believe, then let's help them with that. Getting back to getting away from forcing people to believe a certain way. And when we talk about language and culture revitalization, I really started to see how it brings healing. It brings healing from that historical trauma. It brings healing from uh, substance abuse and things like that. It also creates a community of support where people now are coming together through language and culture and supporting each other with that healing. And going a step further is it's even leading to empowerment of our youth, allowing them to take uh, ownership and control of their lives and what they're doing with their lives and making them stronger. So it's, when we think about, these three things, we want those for our youth. We want those for our children and our grandchildren. Some of us, have started on that path a while ago. There's some that are still waiting to see. So we have to be able to share and talk about these things of how language and culture does help heal, does help create support and empower each other and our youth. But in order to get there, big steps are required. And I'm going to share some examples of these big steps. And we need meaningful change. We can't just talk about it. People in our territory region here will tell you I've spoken about this with education directors, with principals, with chiefs, that whenever we meet, the priority is always language or language and culture, but then it gets put on the side and we talk about other things and we actually don't put meaningful change in place for language and culture. So we need to bring that back and put that as the foundation of everything we do and make meaningful change. And we have to have mandated change. So our leadership needs to guide us by mandating that change. And then we need to implement that change. The best plans are only as good as the implementation of those plans. I can write a brilliant plan, but if it's never implemented, then it wasn't really worth anything unless it's implemented. And again, these are things that are easier said than done. So when we talk about meaningful change will require changing our view of education, going back to our First Nation ways of learning, which includes our ways of knowing, being, and doing. Our elders talk about this quite often, and I've heard it, and I never really understood it for a long time. Our ways of knowing, being, and doing. So we need to, by creating language and culture plans as a foundation for learning, is a way to start. So when I talk about a foundation of language and culture, we need to start from there. And whatever else needs to be brought in is brought in through that context or through that lens of our ways of knowing, being, and doing. I know when I worked with school staff on this, and one of the things they really struggled with was when we were trying to do it the opposite way, where we were trying to indigenize curriculum. And they said, well, we can't indigenize, it's tough to indigenize science or math. But I told them, if you stand from a point or look through a lens of a First Nations perspective, all of these concepts that are in the curriculum were either taught or talked about in a way from our First Nation ways of knowing, being, and doing. And if you think about the everyday activities you do, it always includes science and math, especially out on the land. So how do we look at it from our First Nation lens and incorporating concepts? One of our previous uh, associate executive directors for the Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Center would always say, science didn't fall off the ship with the Europeans. We had science. We had math. We just looked at it from a different perspective. So I always think about that comment she made. One of the things we need to do is ensure that we're planning accordingly, that the plans we make are from that First Nation lens, from that First Nations perspective, and that they're planned in a way to ensure success. We need to be able to produce results, measurable results of how those plans are working. And we need to evaluate success. So meaningful change requires evaluating success and celebrating that success. A lot of times we don't give ourselves credit for the good things that we do, the good things for the people that we work with do. So we really need to make that meaningful change. So we talk about mandated change. Again, I've talked about it a couple of times. Mandated change requires support from leadership. It requires support from parents, and it requires the participation of our staff and students. And again, um, lacking a mandate makes it difficult for us to, as education leaders, especially to enforce meaningful change. And I want to share an example with you. Well, before I get to that, one of the things that I find a lot of our First Nations people don't realize is the importance of language and culture. And again, I attribute that to the colonization and historical trauma that has been um, placed on our people. I've heard even within recent years of people, well, what is the point of teaching language and culture? It doesn't serve our kids a purpose. And it's not shocking, it's not surprising, but it's still unbelievable that we have lots of people, that our own people, that believe that we must still be colonized, that we must still conform to the Canadian melting pot. So again, we have to get people to realize the importance of language and culture and that it plays. So we talk about mandated change, and I know this might be too small for you to share, but we have one community, and I actually had the privilege of working for this community for 16 and a half years. So this year, in June, they put a band council resolution out mandating change in education. And like I said, I know you can't read it up on the screen here, but basically what it says is that the chief and council declare that all education staff speak and use the Cree language daily as part of their school day and as an integral part of their regular instruction. It also says that the elders and knowledge keepers be recognized as a primary source of ancestral knowledge and be present in the schools as much as possible. And that land-based education and revitalization of the Cree language are the foundational components of Fish River education, and all Fish River education employees are to adhere to this declaration. So when we talk about making mandated change, as far as I know, this is probably the first BCR from First Nation leadership that I've seen since I've been in education that's mandating all of their education employees to use the First Nation language daily and making it part of their regular instruction. So after the Chief and Council of Fish River Cree Nation made this BCR, they called upon us at MFNERC to help support their staff in implementation. So our staff has been going out there to help work with them to start changing their planning, the way they plan, the way they're going to implement education to include language, culture, and land base. So I was so happy to see this. Um, I was just excited. I was like, right on, right on. We have an example of mandated change now by our chief, one of our chief and councils, that's basically saying we're going to do it our way. We're going to incorporate our ways of knowing, being, and doing now. Enough is enough. So it's going to be exciting to see how this develops over the next couple of years. And I know their Director of Education, Dr. Nora Murdoch, is working hard to get everything in place and planned so that the implementation is as smooth as can be. So that's an example, a really recent example of mandated change when we want to talk about mandated change. So when we talk about to implement change requires everyone to know and understand the plan. We can't make plans in isolation. We have to include everyone, which includes chief and council, parents, teachers, and students. We need to review that plan regularly and remind ourselves why we're doing this. If it's just a matter of planning and implementing without review, it could lose traction. And again, our plans need to be fluid. We need to be able to modify the plans as needed as things change. Some, every community implemented this type of a plan, the progress would vary. Some may progress very quickly, so the timelines and things would need to be adjusted. And then we need to celebrate success. We need to celebrate our successes in revitalizing language and culture and the successful progress through our plans that we've created. And again, to implement change, we need to just do it. And I didn't steal that from Nike. So one of the things that we've been really talking about is creating a language and culture plan. And I know I don't want to get too in depth into it, but we need to ensure that these plans have a clear vision for what the community wants for language and culture. And again, part of it is going to be finding a local champion who is vital to this process. They're going to have somebody at the local level. They have to have somebody there who's going to be the champion, who's going to make sure that when a plan is created, that it's followed. It needs to include responsibilities for everyone. Who is going to do what? And how is it going to be done? So you need to develop a process of implementation. And this could include programming and so forth. And again, there's lots of examples of successful programming. We need to create lessons, lessons for everyone. They need to be consistently implemented and updated accordingly. And we also need to create laws. We need to create First Nation education laws that will guide and support the efforts of our people. And again, I talked about First Nations perspective or looking at it from a First Nations lens. So when we talk about it, I always think of it, it's not so much of a what, it's more of a how. So when we're incorporating First Nations ways of knowing, being, and doing, we need to consider this when we're creating plans. And I talked about how many times there's attempts made to indigenize current ways of teaching, but it's not the First Nations perspective. If that curriculum was made from a westernized perspective, we can't indigenize it to make it from a First Nations perspective. It has to be looked at differently. And again, looking at it from First Nations ways of knowing and being and doing. And we need to recognize the importance and relevance of First Nation history, knowledge, values, teachings, and including our elders. So it's important that we, again, when planning and implementing, that we look back and remember, you know, these things, because it's going to be tough. It's not going to be easy. So we really need to think about those. And again, one of the things that people should consider is a lifelong learning plan. This is an example of a lifelong learning plan that was created at our organization here a few years back, that looks at, a few different things when we talk about our organization, our service delivery model. You can see in the sweetgrass that surrounds language and culture as part of lifelong learning. In the center, we have different areas. If you think about lifelong learning, from early learning, and to 12 post-secondary, and all of it with language and culture and land-based education, with children, youth, adults, and elders, addressing the physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual pieces. So this will be in the package that will be shared with you. And again, when we talk about examples for language instruction, ultimately what we've been telling people is the only way to go if you want to really seek success with language is immersion. I know schools that have been teaching language as a subject for 4 years, and they've never created a fluent speaker. Bilingual programs help, but where we've seen ultimate success through research and some of our First Nations communities is immersion programming. You can look at processes like language elimination, slowly eliminating English in your school. So the process of elimination is, you say, we're no longer going to say no in our school. If somebody asks you a question and the answer is no, you say Colleen. And you slowly eliminate English from your school. Having elders in the school speaking the language all the time. Putting language in everything. Everything that you possibly can. If you're very low on language speakers in your community, implementing master apprentice programs. Land-based education, incorporating language and culture. First Nations history. It's important that our children know our history, know where they come from. We have a residential school bundle that's going to be released this month that has all the resources for teaching children of all ages about residential schools, but not only about residential schools, but about healing. So teaching those kind of things, engaging in our traditional practices, having feasts, having ceremonies. A lot of places I still travel, when you start talking about ceremonies, they put up their blockers and start saying, hey, you can't talk about that here. Well, why can't we? That's part of our history. And again, our education systems are evolving. Land-based education is a really big, hot topic. Not hot, but it's going well. We have a lot of examples in Manitoba where programs are running awesome, and the children are happy. They're wanting to come to school. They're engaged, and it's all inclusive. So a lot of the activities that are done in land-based education are not based on your academic ability, your physical ability. It's about working together, which is all inclusive. And a lot of our elders talk about how we were always all inclusive of everyone. And we're starting to see a lot of First Nation role models now, who are coming out of programs that are based on the land. We talk about programs for First Nations by First Nations. Land-based education is a good example of that. So again, if anything, I want to reiterate, do it the First Nation way. Include elders and knowledge keepers. Implement their languages and cultures. It's only us that can relate to a shared lived experience with our children and our grandchildren. So take the knowledge that you have. Be understanding of the negative impacts of education. Don't be blind to the fact that our current system is still hurting us. And then start to work to reverse those negative impacts. How can we change it? We hear people talk about we need literacy, we need numeracy, we need the best programs, the best teachers, but if we don't have children in those seats, that means nothing. So how do we bring the children back? It's not going to be because we have the best literacy or numeracy program. It's going to be because we're looking at other things in incorporating First Nations education. And again, be aware of those obstacles that are still out there. The lateral violence from our own people who still believe that our languages and cultures don't have a place. Okay? Be aware of those, and be aware of the government policies that still continue to try and get rid of us, to try and get rid of our languages and cultures. So we can overcome those obstacles, and we can do it in a good way with kindness and with love. And again, that's part of our ways of knowing, being, and doing. And when I speak to educators and education leaders, particularly, one goal I always tell them, one last goal we should have as First Nations education leaders is we should be teaching others to take our place. We should be mentoring, we should be working to lift each other up. And again, if we're not going to do it, who is going to do it? And if we don't teach our youth to take the stances that we want them to, then there's nobody going to do it. So we have to teach others to take our place. And again, this is something recent the elders talked about, is we need to start teaching each other or relearning to lift each other up, to make each other better. As opposed to the westernized view is where we try and step on each other to get to higher positions, higher money, and lots of possessions. So it's a complete contrast in view of lifting each other up as opposed to stepping on each other or grabbing the buckets and or pulling each other down. So again, whether we do this as education leaders, as community leaders, or as community members, it needs to be done. We need to all support each other to get the work done. So I know I talked about a lot of things and gave a lot of personal thoughts, but a lot of that is based on things that I've heard from elders, senior, seasoned educators. And again, I think for many of us, when we started our careers, we thought a lot differently about education than we do after working in education for over 20 years. You start to really see what meaningful education, First Nations education, can be for our children and grandchildren. So with that, comes to the end of my presentation. Jimmy Wechki dinem ka rubis doy kumanogom chai niminandan kakina ka bijay kumanogom teri bibisndan awanan nai kai dizindamanogom mama. Miigwech.
Hitchy Miigwech, Davin. That's an amazing presentation. Thank you very much for presenting to us today. So we'll open it up to questions. I see Ivan, I'm not sure if you had a question.
Yes. Hi, Davin. How you doing?
Hi, Ivan. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Yes, the mandated change there at the Cree school And at that school, I have no clue where it is, the number of speakers in that population, exactly where the First Nation community is. So first question is, do they have like fluent Cree speaking teachers that make up the whole teaching staff at that school? And how is it coming along, like in terms of like regional education, like REAs, and what governments wants in these agreements is to do, like you mentioned about the literacy, numeracy, to follow the province that you're in, and you gotta have these disciplines in your agreement. Then, like the example for ours is we have a strong language and culture component in it, and it is drawing kids. We're meeting success there, but in terms of language and literacy and numeracy, we just in our community, unfortunate, we do have immersion programs, stuff like that. But in terms of teaching staff, we don't have teachers up to the grade levels and the number of teachers to be able to change everything into Mi'kmaq, especially in right through the school. So that Cree community that's been mandated, how is that coming along? And in terms of number of speakers, the community has. We're looking at something like that through proposal-based funding, that to bring in more Mi'kmaq speakers that are out here in the community, but do not have BEDs or are not trained as educators. But we want to utilize their the Mi'kmaq fluency that they have, and we want to pay them just as much as let's say a first-year teacher. So we're using that, and we're trying to get some funds to be able to do something like that. But that community is a lot of interest, the Cree community. Could you talk about that just a little more?
I have a lot of knowledge of that community. As I said, I worked there for 16 and a half years. So right now, if I had to say, they only have about 10 fluent speakers in that community out of a community of um, around 2,000 living on reserve. And they have about 2,000 off. So this is why they've mandated Cree now. And the way they have to do it is they're going to have to do it by everybody learning at the same time. And that's it's going to be a challenge. Absolutely. They're bringing in some people from other Cree communities to help and so forth, but they'll do it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Like our in Nova Scotia here, the MK model, where they have like a sectoral self-government in education. Their education is recognized by the province of Nova Scotia, but they still have to be doing literacy and numeracy curriculum what Nova Scotia offers in everybody in those schools.
And it's the same here.
Yeah, but with the agreement, they're able to start an emergent school. And I would think it's through parent consent that they're able to start an emergent school and build their Mi'kmaq speakers. And my understanding is that they're doing very, very well with the emergent school. Our program is an immersion program with the 4-year-olds, where everything is the teachers and the staff and the people going into that 4-year-old, which makes up the largest number of kids coming into our school.
I'm sorry, Evan. I need 2 minutes, Simon. I apologize. I just need 2 minutes.
Nope. Silent moment.
So Ivan,
Yes.
do you want to keep explaining the program that you're talking about?
Yes, sure. Yes, our immersion program is we in our immersion program, we starting off with the 4-year-old kids that we call them nursery classes, but they're KF4, they're pre-kindergarten. And in those classes, and these kids make up about 55 to 60, 65 kids per year, every year. So we have an immersion setting where the teacher is a fluent Mi'kmaq teacher, as well as an EA or EAs in that classroom, and their sole job is to speak Mi'kmaq all day for those 4.5, 5 hours that they are with those kids. The idea is to instill in them conversational Mi'kmaq. As Davin was saying, there's teachers that have gone through 4 or 5 years of immersion, language classes, but they're not fluent when they come out of there. So the idea here with us is to tackle this problem at a younger age, like 4-year-olds, have conversational Mi'kmaq with our teachers. That's their job. That's what you do. You're there 5 hours. You converse between the teacher and the EA. Everything's done in Mi'kmaq. And the kids, you guide them in conversational Mi'kmaq, not the one word thing at a time, but to be immersed in the language itself. We're seeing success in that, and moving on into kindergarten, we don't have that type of a immersion program, but more of like an intensive Mi'kmaq program. And we have to improve on that. We have to start getting better at those things that we're doing. Ideally, it'll be great to start when kids are born at a younger age. Like, I speak fluent Mi'kmaq, and I learned Mi'kmaq through an immersion setting with parents and all my friends. And we learned conversational Mi'kmaq. We were never involved in the reading of Mi'kmaq or the writing of Mi'kmaq, which is what a lot of approaches are like that here in the East Coast. Anyway, today, that's a lot of them want us to do that. But I believe in immersion setting with conversational Mi'kmaq with fluent speakers. And like I said, we're seeing success in that. And but it's gonna take a long time to build up to where we want to be. And hence, that's why I'm putting this proposal to government, that we want to bring in people from our community that speak fluent Mi'kmaq and become a part of the whole school life. And their sole job would be there like 4 hours, 5 hours, and their job would be to speak Mi'kmaq to all the kids in the cafeteria, at recess, at lunch break, or teachers may invite them into the classroom to converse in Mi'kmaq. And these people are not BED teachers. They wouldn't have a lot of formal education. But it's the approach that we have to take to utilize a resource that's untapped in our community. And like I said, I'm putting in a proposal to do that, because what we're doing now really is going to Heritage Canada to get those funds to be able to do something like that. But we don't want to do that. We don't want to go to Heritage Canada all the time. We want government to say, all right, through a needs-based proposal, funding model for language and culture and special education and so on. But instead of us going through proposals, we want that to be in our agreement as a needs-based funding model, that's as an amendment to our agreement. And we're moving forward very, very slowly on it with delays with government and on and on. And it's getting worrisome now with, caretaker period, potential fall of government, all that, those the barriers Davin was talking about. And it's create these obstacles that keep coming up. And I don't believe we as First Nation communities, we should be justifying to Heritage Canada why we need to idolize and save our First Nation languages. That's government legislation already. So that's the approach we're taking here in Elsipogtog, that First Nation languages are going to be protected, but you did not attach funding to it. So
Yeah.
what we want is government to recognize how important that is, and for them to provide that funding through a needs-based funding model as an amendment to our agreement.
Okay, thank you for that. I guess Davin's back.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That-
Usually I don't get bothered at my door unless it's an emergency when they know I'm in a meeting. So I just had to. It's okay. It's all right. I had to check what was going on. I even have a sign that says I'm in a meeting, so they usually know. But that's okay. It's all good. No, and I thank you, Ivan. And again, you know, we do have one school here in Manitoba that's been running an immersion program for about 7 years now, and they're going to be releasing data that they've collected because they've done a study over the first 5 years of implementation of the immersion program. And what's interesting is in their school, they have the Cree immersion program and the English immersion program. And what they did is they ran those children through simultaneously, and then they tested them on an English academic test. And surprisingly, but not surprisingly, the students in the Cree immersion scored higher on the English test than the students that were only in English.
Yes,
Beyond that, they even did a survey of, you know, who wants to come to school every day. And the Cree students scored higher in wanting to come to school more each day. And then the other thing they questioned them on was who's happy when they're at school. And again, the students in the Cree program, their responses were a lot more positive than the ones in the English. And we've seen that through research with the Hawaiians, with the Mohawk, with the Maori, that the myth that if we teach in our languages, our kids are not going to be smart, it's proven that academically, they'll be stronger. Personally, and through their own responses, they're happier. So who doesn't
Yes.
want their child to score academically higher?
Yeah,
to want to go to school and to be happy at school.
yeah, Davin, that's exactly the same kind of data that we had when we first started our immersion program about 20 years ago. And we were successful. We had like exactly how you explained it. And those kids in the immersion program, we had them tested after 3 years of Mi'kmaq immersion. We had them tested in the New Brunswick provincial assessment at grade 3. And they scored higher than the kids in the immersion program. That's exactly what you see, as well as in terms of coming to school, that was high. And another thing we've seen as well as our Nova Scotia people is the more respect for each other. The teachers observed less bullying and a lot more respect amongst that group of kids. It's like you're saying, it's right through it's right across the country when we do these kinds of programming. And that's our parents were concerned about that. How are they going to do in a provincial assessment? And it showed that when you immerse kids in their mother tongue, give them a solid mother tongue, that they'll do so much better in the future in any other language program.
Yeah, for sure, right on. Thank you, Ivan. Was there any other questions? Sorry, Simon, I'll take over your job.
That's fine. So we got lots of really positive comments in the chat. Thank you for your presentation and Ivan's additions to it. So some of you were asking about getting a copy of your presentation. So everybody is going to receive, all the people that registered for this seminar will receive a package from us probably next week with a video, your presentation, and there's some additional resources in terms of where they can get more information on the language programs. And you got me inspired to dig around a little bit more on the research that you did, and we'll see if we can include some references and materials there. But thank you very much. Our next leadership series workshop is going to be next week, empowering Indigenous education through Indigenous science, technology, engineering, and math. And you said rightly that all this didn't happen when Europeans arrived, and if it didn't fall off the boat, it was already here, and probably a better approach to STEM, certainly because what is it? 80% of the biodiversity is on Indigenous lands around the world, and it just proved that Indigenous approaches are better for the environment and the natural world. So anyways, thank you, everybody. We're getting lots of feedback again through the chat, and have a great day. Thanks, Davin, for taking the time to present for us today. I know you're busy. A friend of mine tells these kids, unless you're on fire, don't knock on my door. You know?
That's a good one. I'll have to use that one.
Anyways, so everybody have a good day. Miigwech.
Thank you. Olha, muito awesome.